Yes, indeed. We're back by the request of absolutely no one. Welcome to our summer edition of the Constitution of American Life with us, the Friends of Publius, or the 4Bs if you prefer. We haven't met now for nearly 2 months, so just in case you forgot who we are, let us do some introductions. We have with us Professor Tim Moore from the University of Wisconsin-Madison at the Center of the Study of the Constitution. Probably one of the primary places, if you're a student of the Constitution, that you'll want to visit their website and look at their resources. He was also a longtime We the People teacher coach in Waukesha, I believe, Wisconsin, outside of Milwaukee. We have Professor Chris Kavanaugh, who is currently teaching in Bismarck, North Dakota. He also acts as a mentor teacher and presenter to We the People teachers in the Mountain Plains areas. And for a number of years, he was the We the People teacher coach in Plainfield, Indiana. Had some great success there and is considered one of the finest civic educators in the United States of America. And we also have Professor Dr. James Michael Williams, Professor of Political Science and Comparative Politics at the University of San Diego. He has been a longtime scholar in the We the People program. In fact, one of the more popular scholars. And I think he's probably one of the nicest people this side of the Mississippi with only one major flaw, and that is he's a Giant fan. But nobody is perfect, as we know. And I am David Richmond. I am the moderator of this program. I taught We the People from its inception in 1988 through 2003, and then was involved at various levels with the We the People program since then. Since we last saw each other, not much has changed. Dr. Williams did purchase a new home in the San Diego area, and right now he's looking for advisors for both indoor and outdoor design ideas for his mansion. So if you have any thoughts, maybe you can get in touch with Professor Williams. Professor Moore and Kavanaugh survived some really weird weather, spring weather, in their great states, going from something like 16 to 80 in 3 days in certain parts there. So, out here in California, we only have 2 seasons. So, that kind of wild trend doesn't happen here. I myself, the only thing that's changed since I last saw you, I've gained about 8 pounds there. And so nothing major. However, the Dodgers are still in first place and have, I think, the first or second best record in Major League Baseball. Inflation is worse, but I have a sense that it's going to stabilize. And yes, America has clearly put an exclamation point on the notion of exceptionalism. We are exceptional beyond a doubt in the fact that we have the highest rate of gun violence in the world of Western-style industrial democracies. Yes, there are other countries that compete with us in Central America, like great democracies and stable countries like Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. They're all up there with us in gun violence there. But so, yes, we are definitely exceptional. So yay, America. So what have we planned for students and teachers of American constitutional and political history is 6 episodes intended to help those new to the We the People program, and also those just generally interested in the Constitution and the various ways to look at that wonderful document. As you know, our discussions are based upon the We the People curriculum established by the Center for Civic Ed. It is not our goal to answer direct questions produced by the center, but to generate some broader discussion that deals with the principles, values, content, context, and conflict implicit in our constitutional system. This week, we are going to be dealing with the first unit of study addressing the question, what are the philosophical and historical foundations of the American political system? And I would like to start this discussion with just a general question for all 3 of this expert panel here. And that is, why does it matter? Why should citizens, both young and old, why should they care about the philosophical and historical foundations of this country? What's the hook here for you guys? Professor Moore?
Well, I'm glad I get first bite at that apple. I think I think the answer is probably, as you might expect from a historian who kind of gets a little nervous when everybody gets all presentism. There's so many events, like, for example, you referenced the events of this tragic events this week again in our country. And I think a lot of discussion that goes on with any major event, tragic or not, I think Americans generally talk about certain things, talk about events in certain ways that really you can tell where they are kind of on a philosophical framework. Those who are going to argue, in favor of a very strong, open-ended interpretation of the Second Amendment are probably more in a tradition of a natural rights philosophy. Whereas those who would look at these events and say, well, maybe we need more regulation or control, they may be arguing from what's called a classical Republican point of view. So I guess the short answer for me is we talk about a lot of things, and I think it's important for us to kind of step back a little bit and see where we are philosophically when we're talking about current events. And I think our discourse does reveal some philosophical traditions in the way we talk about current events.
Professor Kavanaugh?
Yeah, I don't disagree with what Tim said. I maybe think of a different way. I'm going to steal a term that David Adler, a friend of our program, and a scholar in the network, has said. And I like the term he came up with. It's called Madisonian monitors. That calling on all of us, all citizens, to be what he called would be Madisonian monitors, which means we have to pay attention to what's going on, in the current events, as you alluded to, as both of you guys alluded to. But we have to understand those first principles as well, and from where do these first principles come? So it's kind of like that 30,000-foot view, if you will, right? So before we drill down into a specific issue, what were the influences on the framers and the founders? Where were they getting their take on stuff? Like we, as students of this, where do we studied these guys, so where did they get their influence? So it's kind of like that. But if we're going to go back to that idea of being a Madisonian monitor, where we have to keep a check on the government or those that are elected to serve, it's best that we understand those first principles and from where these first principles stem. So I would say that's an important kind of a building block, if you will, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yes, Professor Williams.
Yeah, I agree with both what Tim and Chris said, and I guess I'll just throw some other terms that are kind of saying the same thing. I think it's important for us to look at these ideas, because if you're interested in the legitimacy of the government, of any government, but the United States government, I feel that is at least partially rooted in the political culture of a country and how well the values and political culture align with the way government is actually doing its work. And I think much of political culture becomes political culture because it's unarticulated. It's the invisible, unarticulated assumptions that we are swimming in. And sometimes it's important to raise those up and analyze them to see where they came from and to see, are we straying from those fundamental principles? Does it matter if we're straying from them? But you have to articulate them and define them and discuss them before you can do that sort of presentism analysis that Tim always loves to do.
So, Professor Moore, you kind of laid it out. There are the way the material is presented is there are two primary influences, philosophical influences: the natural rights philosophy and then what we call classical republicanism. And what I'd like to first start off with is context. As I mentioned, one of the things we want to always kind of deal with is context. So if we could talk briefly about the context of these two theories, how they emerge, when they emerge, what are the forces there of natural rights philosophy. Actually, if I want to do a chronological, classical Republican philosophy, and then natural rights philosophy. What do you see as the key elements of context?
Well, one of the hard things about context with classical republicanism is it's a little squishy because there's not a particular person who's most noted to be the advocate of it. I think a lot of scholars would say that, you know, Aristotle, Polybius, and Cicero are your big three there. But you know, you've got Roman and Greek in there, and you're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of years of experimentation, especially in Greece. So the context for classical republicanism is a little harder because there's a bigger timeline, so to speak. But I think if we could focus on Aristotle, and I think the We the People text in Unit 1 does this when they make the point that Aristotle's context is, I mean, he literally just kind of wanders around the Peloponnesian Peninsula and observes places. And he notices there are some places they have the rule of one, there's some places they have the rule of a few, and then they have the rule of many. And he notices that there's good and bad versions. And so, and I think political theorists call that Aristotle's taxonomy. But so the context is one of Aristotle observing stuff and writing this down in his book Politics. So for Aristotle, the context I would say is just observation. It's a little. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And I know you're going to get to, but whereas the natural rights philosophy seems to have some big forces.
Yep.
All right. The absolutism of the previous couple of centuries, the Renaissance, the changing focus or reemerging focus on the individual and such. You don't see any big historical forces at work here for classical republicanism.
No, it's much more organic. And I think that's one of Aristotle's points tacitly, is that he observes all these places that have been evolving over a long time, and he's just making observations. I mean, he's not advocating for anything per se, the way I think that the contract theorists, because that century, to your point, David, you're exactly right. That century, I mean, Hobbes first in the mid 1600s, Locke in the late 1600s, and then Rousseau in the 1700s. So that 1600s is a tremendous upheaval, and these influences are tremendous, and also the role of science. I mean, there's a true commitment to the attempt to implement scientific rationalism into the way societies should operate. So, I mean,
Tim and Chris,
so Hobbes, the context for Hobbes is they've just killed Charles. So he's writing Charles II. So he's writing kind of in the context of, we have an out of control society that's gone so far as to chop the head off a monarch. And so the context, and it's interesting, the whole first chapter of Hobbes is atoms smashing into each other. So I think the context, the way I would read Hobbes is he's trying to make some sense of an out of control world where everything's smashing into each other, and his solution is a very strong, powerful Leviathan. The context, I think, for Locke's a little bit different. I mean, this is after the Glorious Revolution. Things are a bit more stable, and I think he's writing to kind of articulate why the contract they make with William and Mary is a reasonable social contract. Now, Rousseau, Rousseau writes a lot later, and I have a hard time taking Rousseau seriously because he really is kind of a hippie. He wanders around Europe most of his political career, hopping in and out of beds with everybody. And so his social contract is a lot thinner. By thinner, I mean it's not as it's a minimal social contract, and he wants to allow for maximal freedom. And I can't help but really personalize his political theories, if I'm going to psychoanalyze him, I guess, with his experience of kind of being a free floater all over Europe. He's in and out of trouble all the time too. So I don't know if that answers your question about context per se.
No, it does. Chris or Mike, anything you'd like to add to that as far as these competing philosophical traditions?
In terms of context, and I think Tim was absolutely talking about this, is that the pendulum swings. And, and then the pendulum swings one way in terms of the government doing something, and then you have a glorious revolution, and the pendulum swings another direction, and people respond to that swing. And I think you see that much more in the Enlightenment period in terms of that pendulum swinging in Europe, and that response to these Enlightenment thinkers. And, I would absolutely agree with this, what Tim talked about with the Greeks and the Rome. But the other thing about the Greeks and the Romans, I agree with what Tim said, but you're talking about a much broader time frame, and you're talking about two different places with two different cultures and two different societies. And I know the text likes to narrow it down into these nice little political science categories. That's for you, Mike. But it's so much bigger than that. So I think, but the Enlightenment, I see that as a response to the pendulum swinging in a certain way, and writers responding to that.
I'm going to toss this to Mike, but I think economics and the growth of capital, mercantilism and private property, I think probably weighs heavily on context in the 1600s, that drives a lot of this contractual theory stuff. And I mean, Mike's much more attuned on the economics of theory than I am, but I have to think that, and the book does mention the growth of guilds and capitalism as an influence on natural rights theory.
I agree with what Tim and Chris have both said. I have, I guess, an observation and then kind of a question, if it's okay, kind of maybe back to Tim, because it's something that we've talked about in previous episodes. So I guess my observation is that it seems to me like the natural rights philosophy aligns with like the birth of the modern era, right? And everything before that is kind of, we could lump as pre-modern. So that's an observation, but then I don't know if I have much more to say about that. So I'm kind of punting back to Tim and Chris. But I think what I think is important about that is that Aristotle, I was trying to see if I could make it stretch to Machiavelli, which to me is kind of like a hinge point between these two periods. I'm not sure that works, but there's this belief that the focus is on the polis. The focus is on community. And there's not so much this obsession with dissecting and trying to figure out the science of government. It's more, like Tim said, observing how different peoples get together with what purpose. Aristotle says it's the purpose of the good life. And you can have that under one person rule if you have the right ruler, right? So it's a different set of assumptions, it's a different set of questions that to me is the context for what we think about in terms of the foundations of classical republicanism. But like Tim said, it's much harder to pinpoint this because it's a much longer period. There's a lot going on, but I think it could be classified as pre-modern, and that might have something to do, that might be a context that Tim can say more on, or Chris.
Well, I love the fact that, I'm sorry, Tim, I just love the fact I never really thought of Machiavelli as that hinge point, but that's a really great way to describe it. And I think he's much more the father of political science than probably any other writer. And he does it, I think he gets a little bit of a shout out in the text, but I think he kind of gets short shrift for his influences moving forward into the Enlightenment. So for people watching, as students new to the program, Niccolo Machiavelli would be definitely a guy to check out.
So Chris,
Mike's point about the starting point is important. I'd like to put an emphasis on that before the modernists, for our purposes, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, the primary starting point was the community, the polis. After we get into the 17th century, the starting point is the individual. So it's entirely different starting points as the basis of a society. So that's an important point. I think that probably needs to be reiterated that Mike was making.
Well, Chris, I hope I'm not throwing you too much of a curveball here, but I am curious to what extent and we're looking at Locke, all right? To what extent, well, Hobbes and Locke, do they try to fold, this natural rights notion still within a context of classical republicanism, that they they don't reject classical republicanism in its absolute form. They, in essence, they do try to fold that in. Would you see that as an accurate observation?
Yeah, I don't think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, they're not repudiating the classical Republican sense. I mean, it's just not like, oh, this what happened in ancient times is we're moving forward here. I think they're seeing this as I think they see it. I don't want to speak for them there, but I think it's more of an evolutionary process because you're moving from the polis to the individual. And I'm going to go back, and I think that Tim's mention of the focus on economics and private property is a big, huge influence. And that I think is also a big part of influencing these guys, whether it be Locke or Hobbes. And by the way, I want to give a shout out to the Scottish Enlightenment, because there's a book that I've mentioned in previous episodes. I don't have it to hold up, sorry, by Thomas Ricks called First Principles or Founding Principles. First Principles. Excellent book, because he talks about the education of certain founding fathers, and the Scottish Enlightenment, Harrington, Hume, played a big role, I think, in the education of the founding fathers. But I think the idea of the introduction of private property will kind of inspire Locke and Hobbes. Well, Hobbes, then Locke, and Rousseau to a degree. Of that, this is what not only is part of being part of the polis important, not only is being a citizen important, but now it's more of a two-way street. So the idea is, like before, if you think of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, it's kind of a one-way street. There's the community, and then what can you do for the community, right? And now what can the community do for you? Which means, what can the leadership do for you? What can the king do for you? And so I think that you see that developing as a two-way street. So I don't see it as a repudiation of the classical Republican idea. I see it as more of an evolution.
It's interesting. I have two thoughts. One is, both theories kind of, they want the common good. But it seems to me, as I read the classical Republican literature, they are confident that the community knows what it is. And the community defines and heads towards the common good. Whereas the natural rights theorists, for better or worse, believe that individual pursuit of individual rights, acquiring property, all of the outcome of individual effort will produce the common good. So I think they both have that idea of the common good. The mechanisms to get there, I think, are different. Right. And also, it's interesting to note that Locke, the first treatise, is all about natural rights, but the second part of the treatise is this common good. I mean, because he wants, I think Locke understands that if it's all just individual, this thin contract with government and individual pursuit, he's trying to ameliorate that, running off the rails. So the second half of the treatise is, we have to hold that common good in mind as we individually pursue. So Locke's treatises themselves, I think, address your question. Do they abandon that notion of classical Republican common good?
And I think we see that played out on this side of the Atlantic when you think about who has a seat at the table. Who's the original we the people? White male property owners, people that have property, they have a stake in how that society and that common good is going to run. So if it's good for them, it's going to be good for everybody else.
Trickle down.
I was going to say trickle on, but yeah, trickle down.
Well, go ahead, Mike.
I just want to emphasize, it seems to me that natural rights philosophers are appealing to our heads. Like, we're thinking about our self-interest. Like, does it make sense for us to do contracts with each other so we don't get beat up by the biggest person in the place, right? Classical Republicanism kind of appeals to one's gut, like this feeling like that you want to be part of something bigger than yourself. So I think the very fact that Locke is spending time trying to do this, I think speaks to the fact that as human beings, we need both. And I think we see over time different justifications. So I think of like John Stuart Mill, a classic justification of natural rights philosophy through utilitarianism, right? That the common good comes out of the individual desires, how that gets that whatever that majority is, that's what the common good is for that moment. Kant would say something different. Kant would say something like, well, the fact that we have a society where each of us individuals can define our own common good and be free to pursue it, that's the common good. And we don't want government to get in the way to tell us what the community thinks. The great thing about natural rights philosophy is that we can all individually pursue it. But the point is, a larger point is that philosophers, both at the time of the founding, before and after, are grappling with that gut part of it. Like, we need to convince people that they are bigger than just themselves, because that's the only way you're going to get them to go to war and pay their taxes and obey the laws without holding a gun to their head or a bayonet to their chest or something. So.
Well, and Tim, the way you described it, especially with the classical philosophers, this idea that they trusted the polis to be able to identify what the common good, it seems to me that was quite dependent upon this notion of homogeneity.
Yeah.
All right. And sameness. To what extent, and this is to all three of you, but starting with you, Tim, to what extent are natural rights philosophers and the circumstances, the context in which they're in, are being somewhat forced to move away from this notion from homogeneity? And we know that is the plague on the American Enlightenment, the American constitutional order, is we are, even in the 18th century, we're quite diverse, and that diversity has intensified. And it seems that as that diversity has intensified over 200 years, the notion of a republic and the common good has gotten more and more challenging for us to uphold. So I am wondering, did the Enlightenment thinkers have to grapple with this notion of homogeneity, or am I just making something up out of
No, I think I have two thoughts on that, and they actually might be relevant. One, I can't help but think about the cover of the first edition of Leviathan. If you really look at it, it's got like hundreds and hundreds of faces on the monarch. And it really kind of is a great thesis statement about what's in the book. It takes a powerful Leviathan to ride herd on all these individuals. So I think in some ways Hobbes' cover addresses your question. The other thought I had is that another one of Locke's books was A Theory of Moral Sentiments. I think he's wrestling with what happens if individualism runs way out to its logical extent. I think he's proposing this theory of moral sentiments that maybe that I would read as kind of, here's a potential glue that holds us together as we pursue these individual efforts. So I think they do intend to address that issue that you've asked about in the modern with the modern contractual theorists. Yes.
Tim or Chris or Mike, any thoughts about this notion of homogeneity and that theme running through these theories? And do you agree with me that it's become more problematical as the world has evolved, especially the United States, but even Western Europe, is far more heterogeneous and diverse than the 17th century?
Working backward, it's a problem, because now, with the idea we recognize more people under the law and their ability to exist as people. I mean, the government or courts recognize people's personhood, and until the courts recognize your personhood, you're almost like persona non grata. Your ability to access power, whether it be political power, social power, economic power, is going to be extremely limited. And so I think it makes it more difficult, though it shouldn't. It has made it more difficult working backward. And I think I think Hobbes, I think Locke, moving forward to Rousseau and others in the Enlightenment period, they had a very narrow view of who this was necessarily going to apply to. So I think it was very similar to the framers and the founders. There was a very narrow view of who the polis was at that point.
That's why Rousseau was not liked by the founders, because he broadened it to women as a part of the social contract too. So
yeah, Yeah, I can't speak. I don't know enough about 1600s and how Locke was applied, like in the English Empire, whether Irish folks.
He was ignored.
Well, I mean, yeah, fair enough. But I would say that there's a difference in diversity and then who you let into your political community. So I'm just echoing Chris's thought. I think the way around that, I mean, the way our founders, I think, got around a lot of the assumptions built in natural rights philosophy is you just define out of the equation who you consider part of the political community. And then, yes, David, to your point, and to Chris and Tim's point, as we have slowly expanded to let into the political community this diversity that has always been there. We've always had men and women. We've always had gay and straight. We've always had black and white. We've always had native and not native. But it's only recently that they are now equal citizens. That's where it becomes problematic, because now there's a group of people who have spent a majority of their history not used to sharing power with these other groups. So I think, to me, that's the flashpoint.
And just let me jump in here. Sorry, David. For the students that may be new to the program or new to the curriculum, look in the back of the book in the reference section in the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And they have some language in there, and this is coming out prior to the Declaration of Independence. And the key phrase is you get these rights when you enter into a state of society, which is the whole concept of, well, knowing that women will never enter into a state of society, African Americans, enslaved people, Native people will never enter into a state of society. So that, that protects their little circle of whoever we, the people, are at that time.
So, Mike, I want to jump to you, and Tim said something very early on as we look at current issues, understanding the philosophical and historical foundations might be an imperative because of understanding where one approaches such modern issues. And so I am wondering, to me, one of the key questions of at least the last couple hundred years is the role of government in the lives of individuals. And so how do you see classical thought and natural rights thought conflicting on what role should government play in the lives of both the collective, the community, or the and the individuals? How do they differ, and if so, are they in any way similar?
Yeah, no, they do differ. And I tell me if this is not answering the question the way you framed it, but what I think is important for students to recognize is that for the classical republicanism, folks, liberty is a product of society. Like, you are free when you are actually part of the community. Whereas natural rights philosopher says, no, those rights are pre-social. Like, those are given to us by God or providence or whatever, right? So to me, that is the key point to understand about then the relationship with government. Because if your interaction with government is one of which you are encumbered with, right, then you're going to see a much bigger role for government, because government is part of you and you are part of the government, versus if your rights predate the institutions, right, then your relationship to that government is going to be less effective, like less loving, less familial, right? It's more of like, no, I have these rights before we ever had a parliament or a Congress or whatever. So that influences the way people, I think, see what the role of government should be. So that's my first crack at answering that.
So, and again, this is to all three of you. My struggle with both of these, and maybe it's Hegelian analytics here, in the sense that the seeds of this idea's destruction are found in its very idea. And that is this notion of the common good, all right, and the good of the many, all right, verges on fascism and can easily transition into fascism, is in that the state is all powerful there because it represents the polis. And the danger of natural rights, to me, is anarchy and the collapse of community, the collapse of a communal identity into anarchy there. am I off base in that analysis?
No, I mean, how you did that in 2 sentences, David. Yeah, running these theories out on to their fullest extent is problematic. Absolutely, you're absolutely right.
Yeah,
I was actually, believe it or not, doing a little preparation for this evening, and came across some stuff from Tocqueville, and we know about, the I'm going to quote him here. The principle of self-interest, rightly understood, is not a lofty one, but is clear and sure. And then the idea is, he says, each American knows when to sacrifice some of his private interests to save the rest. And I don't know if that's, I'm not sure about that, because I would think that would require some type of education.
Yeah.
Right. Which, of course, is what we have invested so much of our lives in terms of that civic education. So the idea is that we know when to back away from what we want. According to Tocqueville, I'm not sure I'm buying that. So I would, yes, David, I'm agreeing with you. I think this, and we might be seeing that now.
Yep. And the way you framed it, David, was so good. I think you nailed it. I was doing some research as well, and I came to a book. I have a book to hold up, a book that is from 1996. Yep, Michael Sandel's Democracy's Discontent, that I have not looked at in years. But I think it's accessible to high school students. A very good argument about the arguments to justify what he calls the procedural republic, which is a natural rights government, and then classical republicanism. And he makes this argument that we shouldn't believe in classical republicanism because it is naturally coercive. He says, yeah, under Rousseau, you're probably right. That's always a fear. He sees Tocqueville, though, as that kind of middle. He doesn't see Tocqueville as advocating as strongly as Rousseau's sort of general will. And that what Tocqueville is observing, he says, is that in American associational life, you have this habituation where people are beginning to work together, not because they're being forced to, but just because it's a practice. And that's what Sandel says is the promise of classical republicanism. You need to give people the space to work together as practice, to choose that, versus coercing them to work together like Rousseau may have maintained.
I just think of I've got a continuum I just thought of, and I know Tim is his love of continuums, but I'm thinking of Tocqueville calling us a nation of joiners, right? Think of it. He describes his experience in the early republic as a nation of joiners. And I'm going to fast forward a couple hundred years to our boy Robert Putnam and bowling alone. So in that time frame, I don't know what my point is, but I just had thinking of Tocqueville and the idea that we are a nation of joiners. That, people drop their plows and have a political discussion. They're going to join every little civic organization in their village or community because they can, because they have the ability to now. To the point where, we're bowling alone. For those of you folks not familiar, watching this, Robert Putnam, I think he came out in 2000. Is that right? 2000, Bowling Alone. Political scientist from Harvard.
Yeah,
Harvard, yeah.
And what's interesting is his post 9/11 minimal retraction, somewhat, because we saw this brief period, and it made him go, well, maybe not so much. I think people are passionate about these two ideas on both sides. I've probably gotten more romantically inclined towards classical republicanism, and I needed to be reminded that hey, one of the closest representatives of classical republicanism in the 20th century was probably Germany in the 1930s. There, if we think about their principles, and I do believe that America has taken the natural rights notion, especially if we look at current events, is my right to a gun. All right, takes preeminence over anything else in society, and that we've forgotten about obligation, to the community there. And so both of these ideas, again, have positive attributes to American constitutional thinking, but students, I think, need to be aware of the dangers as we go farther out there. There are numerous other influences and ideas, and Professor Kavanaugh, I'd like to turn to you. One of them, and I'm going to be honest, I struggle with a little bit because in an earlier episode, I don't know how far back, Professor Moore kind of slapped me around a little bit about my understanding of constitutional theory there. And I'll be honest that my understanding is probably a fairly low level relative to the three of you. And my primary source is, of course, the We the People book there. But if you could, what does constitutionalism mean in a theoretical sense? And then where do we see constitutionalism, in a practical structural sense in our system?
Well, I think there's constitution. I'm going to change the wording up just a little bit. I think there's constitution and then constitutionalism, if that makes sense, right? So dealing with the idea of a constitution, it's kind of laid out, and I'm gonna just borrow this from John Patrick, who is a scholar in our program, and for those, I'm going to hold up a book. It's a pamphlet, actually. So we've held this up before. This is available online for free. Understanding Democracy, a hip pocket guide. So you can download it for free. Tim's grabbing a book. Okay, does not want to be outdone. But these are the 7 things that John Patrick, Indiana University professor emeritus, talks about for constitutions. And I see this is not the theory. This is the practice, right? What does the Constitution have to do? It's got a statement of the purpose of government. We see that in the preamble. It's got a specific specifications on the structure of government, which we see that laid out in the 3 branches, as well as the interplay between the branches and the following articles. Enumeration, distribution, and limitation of powers is creating a limited government. Provisions about citizenship, who gets the seat at the table. Guarantees of human rights, means of electing and appointing government officials, and the procedures for changing that or amendments. So that is the idea of a constitution, right? And we I know that in the text it talks about this is the idea of you can have a government with a constitution doesn't make it a constitutional government. There are numerous societies and nations in the history of the world, Russia being one of them, that has a constitution. It's not a limited government, right? And certainly rights are not protected.
And that's my point is every nation state, the community has a constitution, but it doesn't make them all constitutional. And my understanding is that to be a constitutional government, those written words must have effective means in which to be enforced and applied. Yes. All right. That is, there has to be effective limitations on power. And that's a real, again, talk about squishy concept. What is an effective limitation on power versus an ineffective limitation on power?
Well, I think that, and the big ones that are taught in the text, obviously the separation of powers, right? Checks and balances and rule of law. I mean, if you want to, that might be the big 3 to start with for the kids getting into the text and the curriculum. And we see that within the articles, but we also notice that, if you read Federalist 47 through 51, Madison saying we do separate out the powers, but they can't be separated out completely. There's got to be some interplay between the branches. You see, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The idea, as he mentions in Fed 51, that each branch must be given power to check the other branches. And the concept of rule of law, going back to our boy John Adams in the Massachusetts State Constitution, which was 1780, the rewriting of the Massachusetts State Constitution, which Adams pretty much wrote himself, as I understand it, is the idea that no person is above the law. So those are all lofty goals, I think, but that makes part of a constitutional government. Have we always followed those? No. Do we struggle with following those? Of course we do. But, sometimes we've done a good job and sometimes we haven't.
Anyone else want to dance with that? Because again, I hate to say it, that seems to be the American language. We always have an out, and that is, well, we don't always follow it. And I'm going to make an argument, Chris. I think we rarely follow it. We have these shining moments of accountability.
David, have you been sitting on the other episodes where I've been present and ripped on these things? You should be driving the bus to look behind you to see I'm the radical back here going, this is
yeah, and again, I guess no, and I agree with you, and I appreciate the approach and tone that you took there, but I want students to think seriously about this, and that is there really a way to design a constitution that overwhelmingly is applied consistently, all right, in a society of governed by people there. And like I said, my reading of history is more often than not, we don't, all right, follow constitutional principles, all right, and we rationalize that. And every now and then we'll have a highlight in which we, oh yes, see, we held it together. That is, we held people accountable. We held government accountable there. Right. And well, again, I probably am a minority on this panel there, but
no, we'll go back.
That's my struggle with this principle and kids having to deal with it.
We'll go back and see my first point about being Madisonian monitors, right? The idea of this is why this is important, right? This is why this is important to have an understanding of this. And I agree with you on most of that, David. I want Mike and Tim to jump in here.
Yeah, no, as I was prepping for this, I came across something that I just wanted to share. So, under the English political system, Parliament is sovereign, right? So it's a relatively mechanistic, easy way to think of constitutional theory. What Parliament says is constitutional, period, right? And what you said a moment ago, how, well, let me just say, when the Americans decide to step away from that model and to put the Constitution separate from, above the government, by that very nature, I'm not letting us off the hook at all, David. I agree with you, but it's setting in motion a much more difficult way to figure out how do we know when something is constitutional or not. And that is not in the four corners of the document. That is why we can take our Constitution, our Madisonian system, and put it in Iraq, and it's going to fail miserably, because these discussions about what is and what is not constitutional, that's just the practice of politics. And that's where we have talked about the role of courts, the role of parties, the role of media. So I just want to point out to the students what a difficult dance this is once you say what is constitutional is separate from what the government does. You're setting up a whole bunch of different things that you don't have in the English system, which is what we have. Does that make sense, David? Or
yeah, it does. And I thought that was wonderfully said. And I kind of want to follow up with Tim, because here's one of the, I guess, inherent contradictions of philosophical and legal. And I know you don't like the legal too much, and maybe I don't know if I'm right on using the term legal, but if we look at Locke, I think Locke at least is most often quoted within the We the People program. I don't know if that means he's the most influential. I think Montesquieu is probably more so in some ways in the 18th century, but the idea of Locke and prerogative power, all right, prerogative power of the legislative and executive power. So how do we square that with this notion that we have effective means to limit power of the government? That's been a struggle of mine for 30 years.
Yeah. Can I back up just a little bit?
Of course you can.
Well, I guess I'm sitting here and here's what I hear. Theory is really problematic. You said it, David. Classical republicanism run out to its nth degree equals fascism. Natural rights theory run out to its nth degree is anarchy. So theories, that's why I would suggest that history is more important than theory. And I think
I'm shocked.
Mike's point. Well, I mean, I say this because, and I love the We the People curriculum. We've all taught this for like decades and decades, and it's a fantastic curriculum. But if I had one critique in Unit 1 is that it doesn't really address this dilemma that you're talking about, David. And that dilemma is easy. To Mike's point, it's very easily resolved in an English system. We don't need theory. We have Parliament. Whatever. See Parliament. Constitutional theory, schmeary. You know, we don't. We got Parliament. That's it. And so, and that's why I think the British history piece. I mean, I think we talked about a little bit about this episode before, and I think one of the questions we were possibly going to consider is, was British history as important or more important than the philosophies that we've been talking about? Now, I would argue it is, but I'm generous enough to concede that I might be wrong on that. But English history and the way they do constitutionalism, they don't do theory. They do constitutionalism, and it's called Parliament. And that's a much easier system. And Mike's point, when you separate that Constitution as from government, you automatically are into theory, and you always are going to screw up, especially when you got two theories in play like we do. So I think for me, theory is always a stumbling block. History is much easier in that regard, but it's not very. Americans are not into Constitution equals government. I mean, we had a whole revolution against that theory or that practice.
If you spoke with a little bit of a German accent and you brought in the word realpolitik, I could think that maybe it was like Henry Kissinger sitting there.
Sorry.
No, I think that's
President Nixon. I think be.
No,
Well, I'm glad you recognize this struggle that I've had for at least 3 decades, and maybe my advice is to students is to take what Professor Moore said pretty seriously. Is in this unit, we want to understand these philosophical principles, and it's true throughout all of history. It's great to be a philosophy student and fall in love with these ideas that challenges, okay, let's put them into practice there. And whereas in England, Parliament is sovereign, and so whatever they say goes. Is it accurate to say that, what we do is we say, well, we'll give it to the courts, and whatever the courts say that will be the Constitution? Is that an accurate understanding of maybe the differences between the two systems?
Well, we do seem to trust the courts to tell us what our Constitution is, so we maybe moved it to a different branch. I mean, it might be.
We used to.
Well, I think we still do, and maybe to your sensibilities, you don't like that. But I think the mere fact that we do it, regardless of political outcomes, I think we do see the courts in that way.
I would agree with that. I'm just like alluding to what we see now in terms of where the public opinion in terms of our courts are going. And I would, for the students especially, you think about there's theory and then there's reality. And all you have to do is like get pulled over by the police, right, one time, and you think about there's the theory of you have certain rights, but hey, when you get pulled over by the police officer, then it becomes real. So there is the theory of what the law says and what your rights are and how the government's supposed to work. And there's the reality on the street.
And so, Tim, could you just briefly, because I use this term prerogative power and assuming something I shouldn't have.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I derailed that whole question. I'm sorry.
How do you understand the prerogative power, and if you could delineate between legislative and executive?
Well, Locke's prerogative is the executive, or he acknowledges that there's this prerogative power. And I look cynically at political theory and political science. Sorry, Mike. I see that as his necessary and proper clause. Here's an out. I mean, somebody in our previous discussion talked about Americans always have an out. So the prerogative power is one of those, in the future, there's going to be some crazy stuff happen, and it's not in the Constitution, and we need somebody to be the final decider. So I kind of cynically see the prerogative power as that out clause in Locke's theory, whether it be executive or the legislature, which for Locke, the legislature is supreme. So I'm probably the wrong person to ask that political theory question about prerogative, because I take a dim view of it.
Well, I take a dim view of it as well. I'm just trying to square it, with this notion of limited government and effective limitations. And it seems that prerogative power blows this notion out of the water. If the president or the Congress, or I couldn't tell if I froze or not.
You felt in ways when they looked at necessary and proper.
Yeah. So Mike or Chris, thoughts on prerogative power and constitutional government?
Well, my go-to is always Lincoln, using what we call retroactive authorization or ratification, going back to Locke and the prerogative power. But, at least Lincoln throws himself, doesn't throw himself, but he goes to Congress. I did these things. Now make it right. You guys weren't in session. I had to take action because there's an emergency. And so I think that, I think Tim's assessment of Locke's view of prerogative power is pretty accurate. I was thinking maybe more like the Ninth Amendment, but I didn't want to throw that out there for Tim because you might get all apoplectic on us. I had to work that in. But yeah, I think that, was it in Youngstown Sheet 2 about the emergency power of the executive, and I think it was Justice Jackson said, if we say that this is the case, then the president's always going to be finding emergencies. So I'm a little hesitant on that as well. But at least in Lincoln, in terms of the outbreak of the Civil War, at least he goes to Congress and said, I did it. Now you fix it or not.
And there's a great piece of evidence to me of the inculcation of principle into the person. Lincoln understood the dynamics, and to me, he does the classical notion of virtue, and again tries to uphold the framework of our entire system, and say when Congress gets back and says, "Okay, I did this." All right. If the system worked like that consistently, I'd be dancing in the streets all the time. But Lincoln may be an outlier historically on this kind of situation. Mike, any thoughts?
Yeah, I read something this week about how, I'm trying to bring it back to the classical Republican natural rights thing. That, natural rights philosophy has us all as individuals, as Tim said, we're atoms coming into each other. That's our relationship. Whereas classical republicanism, our identity is through self-government, right? We're part of the government process. So when I'm thinking about the idea of limited government, prerogative power, like what's the role of the people? And in terms of, there's a role there to be played, but if our assumption is that we are not part of a group that's actually self-governing, that we're all just sort of individual rights bearers or individual consumers, it's actually disempowering, right? And I think the lesson of history and of politics is that elites, maybe Lincoln is an exception, right, are take advantage of that. I mean, I was thinking about something so clear as with our founders, right? The clear notion of Congress shall make no law, and the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts, and nobody does anything. Like that, to me, that's not even prerogative power. To me, that's just like an affront of what all these principles were supposed to do in terms of limited government. And for the purpose of an emergency, they were bypassed. And that to me, Dave, gets to your point. It's just another example. If there's a conception of self-government, I don't know, maybe the outcome's different, maybe not. I'm sorry, I kind of went down a detour and then I ran into a.
Well, hopefully the students are seeing what a struggle this is.
Well, I think this. I mean, since this is not a time-sensitive broadcast, I think the events of the last few days illustrate this, because as David, as you led into our show, the Center for Disease Control says now the leading cause of child death in this country now is gun violence. And so we have this group of people clamoring to protect the Second Amendment and my individual right to own a firearm versus the collective good. Can we just step back and say, well, if this is killing our children, maybe we should do something about it? And I think we see this debate being played out within this current event right now in terms of what's good for the nation and all people. And the idea of going back to Tocqueville, well, people will know and they got to surrender some stuff here for the common good. But we're not seeing that. So I think that this whole...
Right, and it is real interesting as we move to much more of the historical thing. What I found interesting was I read a column today looking at other countries who have faced similar crises. Specifically, they looked at England, New Zealand, and Australia, all three within the same genealogy, I would say, of the United States, democratic forms of government emanating from the British Empire there. And, those three countries, when faced with a similar crisis, Parliament and, the government respond fairly swiftly with some kind of solution. Not that there wasn't some contentious debate. There definitely was in Australia, a little bit in New Zealand more recently there. To me, I think students need to take a look at least at our cousins in this great democratic experiments, how their systems are a little bit different. And I think, to some degree, I think they tend to handle crises differently and to some degree more effectively. Because, and help me out, I don't know enough about New Zealand and Australia, Mike. I know you've been to Australia. They're parliamentary forms, right? And parliament is sovereign.
Yeah.
So again, it is interesting note there as far as the historical, looking over time, the ability of the government to respond to things. It seems like the parliamentary system has a little one-upmanship on our system of separation of powers, checks and balances. And again, that might have to do with the history, all right, of our evolution versus those other places. So, and Chris, go ahead, Mike.
I'm sorry, but
no,
I do think like an analysis of parliamentary systems versus separated systems in terms of passing the policy is a good thing for students to look at. I also think that one of the differences between our cousins and ourselves is the existence of slavery. And I think I'm not going to make an argument that this is a direct cause, but I do think that the notion of safety and security and the need to use violence to protect oneself from others is rooted in our society in a way that's not rooted in Australia, Britain, and New Zealand. Our modern day police force come from militias getting together to make sure fugitive slaves, got back to the plantation. That's our history. So I do think there is something about that is also worth looking into in our history. When we think about the limitations of which when people want to enact policies to restrict handguns or restrict one's ability to protect oneself in the most powerful country in the world with the most powerful military in the world, right? That we need to protect ourselves. So I just wanted to add that.
So Chris, Tim said it a few minutes ago that British history in the 17th and 18th century probably is far more important than the philosophies. All right, these philosophical principles. I'm going to assume for a moment that you agree with him.
I do.
And why is that? And what is it about British history?
I have a book to show. It has nothing to do with anything anybody said, but I just wanted to show a book.
Oh, okay. So what do you see as the key elements in British history of the 17th and 18th century that shape America and therefore are far more important maybe than the philosophical foundations?
Well, I think I'm not saying the philosophy is not important. I do think the philosophy is important. I mean, I think that is, we've established that is a foundational piece, but the actual history is where the rubber meets the road, to use that cliche. that, you got to put this philosophy into action. And we see the British doing that. And I go back to Mike's point about Parliament being sovereign. It was easy. Well, actually, I'm going to go back before that, because there was the point where the king was sovereign.
Yep.
And then there becomes a giant urinating contest between the king and Parliament. And I think they had a little kerfuffle in Great Britain about that, some revolution or something. I don't know. So this giant contest, who's going to use Tim's word, is sovereignty. And I've become a convert to that word, sovereignty, because it really does become about taking a philosophy, whether it be a natural rights or a classical Republican philosophy, putting it into practice. Somehow, someone or some group is going to have power. And you see that power emanating from an individual being a king. The God is shining his light on this king, and from him the light shines, and he decides who gets whatever. And then you see Parliament stepping in, and you see this wrestling contest. It gets really ugly, of Parliament wrestling power, sovereignty away from the king. And then by the time, we started settling on this side of the Atlantic, you see colonial governments having a degree of sovereignty. And then we have a revolution to get sovereignty here. And then we have a constitutional convention. And it's like, now we're going to take sovereignty away from these states and give it to this national government. So, so I that's why I agree with Tim. One, he's a good looking man and he's smart. And, but I think the whole idea is that at some point, theory has to be put into practice. And so you have to think about the actual British history and the struggle for who has this power.
Well, Chris, we're going to talk about in a little bit what might be considered a turning point in British colonial history. But I am curious, are there shadows of problems in the colonial British system in the 17th century?
Oh yeah.
Are we clear about our identity being British? Are we clear about the legal political structure here, or do these problems that emerge after the 7 Years' War, do they predate the 7 Years' War, and not only by 10 years or so, but maybe by 100 years?
No, I think there's always. You look at the very first documents that these colonials create when they hop off the boat. There's this mixed notion of their identity. They tip the hat to being British, our dread sovereign, King James. They articulate these very British things, but in the same document, there are these phrases where they're talking about being localized identity. We need to create a system for us. We are, this errand into the wilderness, that we're sort of British, but there's this mixed identity in some of these very first statements. So to your point, David, yeah, this identity and status is very problematic from the very beginning. And they want to insist that they're still British. They have the rights of Englishmen. That's in all of those documents. Just because we've moved across the water doesn't mean we've changed status, but they're going to call themselves something slightly different at times. Two important things I think to think about in terms of this. Chris referenced this. Parliament does a couple things in the 1600s that really, really are troublesome to the British colonials, and it involves revoking stuff. Parliamentary sovereignty. At a couple of points, Parliament revokes their status by calling them dominions. Not, and what that means is. You're a conquered people. You're not fully British. The colonials hate those. The Dominion of New England is a great, and there was tremendous backlash to that in the colonies. That's 1600s. They also, when Parliament revokes charters, that's a real problem for British colonials in the 1600s. So there's a lot of parliamentary sovereignty that the colonials don't like in the 1600s.
Chris?
No, I'm going to defer to Tim on that. Absolutely. Because there is this, now we're talking about identity, right? This identity crisis. I can't help it. I always think of Frederick Jackson Turner and his frontier thesis. which is, published way in on the census of 1890. But he says, what separates us from our European ancestors is our life on the frontier, and going back to this idea of perhaps individualism, but also not only the individualism, but there is a collective nature in these early settlements, because without that collective nature, they don't survive in the wilderness. So it is, I think it's a struggle for this identity, trying to cling to this British heritage, but you're also establishing something that's new and different.
They don't want to be Irish. I mean, these British colonials don't want to be Irish, and that's what they're looking to. The way the British treated the Irish as defeated people. So none of those Brits want to be defined as such.
Their loss.
So
I'm Irish too. I hear you.
We're very clear that, again, British constitutional struggles of the 17th century are going to have a profound effect on the colonies. One, philosophical, which we've already talked about a little bit. Hobbes, Locke emerge, their writings emerge from that conflict. I am wondering that it seems to me that there becomes this parallel history within the empire, within England, and then a parallel history. And I'm wondering, to what extent does the fact that we are absent of a feudal tradition culture in the colonial territories, all right, and there seems to be an unlimited amount of land, relatively speaking, what impact is that going to have on the development of the two entities? Is it an important one, or is it just kind of a sidebar? The fact that we don't have any kind of feudal tradition here in the colonies.
Well, I'm going to push back on that a little bit, David, because I say we do, and you see that developed into plantation societies in the South, which really almost mirror that feudal system that existed in terms of the lord of the manor, and you have this, sustained, self-sustaining kind of culture around this plantation, which is going to involve enslaved people, right? And we know the planter elite will be controlling society, they'll be controlling the politics, they'll be controlling the economies. You don't see that necessarily developed in the middle colonies and in the northern colonies. So that may play a role there, but I would say that we do have somewhat of a feudal system.
Well, I'll agree with you that by the 19th century, that's firmly grounded in especially the deep South. But 17th century, early 18th century, you think that system is formed in a mature sense?
Well, not in a mature sense, but it's well on its way.
I mean, in the North, Americans don't have that hierarchialism. In fact, in many ways, America is a reaction against European hierarchialism. And ironically, they practice it in some spots around the continent. So I think your point about the lack of a hierarchical tradition, and New Englanders prided themselves in being anti-hierarchical. I mean, that's one of the basic differences between the way that the South viewed the North and the North viewed the South. An absence of hierarchialism was wonderful. And the South said an absence of hierarchialism is terrible. So one may, to Chris's point, one part of the country may be articulating a European sensibility, and New England's not.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask, I'm sorry, Mike, but something else, and Tim is definitely an expert more in this, in terms of religion, the religious aspect in both, in these areas within the colonies, I think absolutely plays a role as well.
Yep. Yeah, the congregational approach to church polity versus a hierarchical system of the Anglican or Catholic. Right. Yeah.
Mike, you were going to jump in?
Well, I mean, I think slavery is the one huge glaring example of feudalism. But Dave, I think your broader point is well taken. Like, if you were not a slave, yeah, that social hierarchy that was very rigid in England doesn't exist in the United States. I mean, and I have to admit, everything I've learned about this was through a book recommendation through Chris, American Slavery, American Freedom by Edmund Morgan. Is that right? Yeah. And even if you were an indentured servant, in the beginning Virginia colony, there were indentured servants, but even those were time bound. And then once you were released from servitude, you had the ability to to make your way in society, right? To rise up. Slavery was brought in as an institution to do the labor that they couldn't get done with the indentured servitude, right? So David, I think your point is right. I also think Chris is right that slavery is this example of feudalism. I don't know enough about there's an interesting comparative analysis there around identity, around all that kind of stuff based on those regions. But I'll finish this by saying what has emerged from that, right? Americans don't know their history, but they know their philosophical taglines. So we know give me liberty or give me death, right? We know no taxation without representation. We don't know any of the history around it. And we know what's come out of what you point out, Dave, is this American myth that everyone can be a millionaire, or everyone can make their way in society, that I think comes out of this real economic circumstance that, unlike England, yeah, if you were not a Black slave or a Native American, maybe you had that opportunity. So,
well, yeah. and I would just throw, for students of history, I would throw out something called Bacon's Rebellion. So it's not just, enslaved people, the indentured servants at a certain point too, right? Yeah. And going back to my boy Turner, and he talks about when things crystallized in the East, we always had that safety valve to our West, which is land. And what he meant by crystallize is the idea is that there's no fluidity. The idea that now you're going to rise up in society because now your 7-year time period for indentured servitude is over. When the land gets bought up, you could always, go west and start over again.
Didn't Turner, it's been a while and it's after 1800, but didn't Turner actually say the West functioned to make us less European?
Oh,
I
much
think
so.
that's actually, yeah. I think that's actually a sentence that he used.
Well,
yeah,
sure. But yeah, that's exactly what we talked about. Okay. It's our experience on the frontier, and the frontier's draw, right, always had that promise.
So quick question for you, Tim, and then we want to move on. I'm just curious, primogeniture is a key element of British society. Why doesn't it follow the flag over to the colonies?
Well, there's one historian that said it's because a lot of these cats coming over were second sons. That'll get rid of primogeniture real fast. And I think to some degree it is a commitment of anti-hierarchialism, that feature in our system.
Do you guys want to define that though, real quickly, for students that are maybe new to this? Primogeniture, you want to define that?
Oh, where the first son gets everything.
Firstborn.
Yep.
The firstborn son gets all the land, and the second-born son goes into the priesthood.
Goes to America.
Yeah, goes to America.
Or the military.
Or the military. Right. That's right. So the turning point, obviously, in this relationship in which we now see the theories values start to come alive, of course, it's the 1760s, following on the coattails of the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War. So, Tim, why is that the decade that you think shines the greatest light on understanding America's revolutionary principles and kind of, first principles as a people?
Well, I think most importantly, the 1760s points out the dilemma of British constitutional practice. In the beginning of the 60s, Parliament, in the 60s, they passed a series of laws. Now, I think a lot of history books get it wrong when they say they were just laws that impacted the pocketbooks. But another way to look at these laws in the 1760s is they were what colonials said to be a usurpation of the prerogative power of Parliament. First thing they do in 63 was say, all that land that we gained from the French, you can't go there. Well, that runs afoul of British tradition of the right of soil through trial by blood. The Stamp Act, colonials see that as a constitutional violation. We tax ourselves, we don't have anybody in Parliament that we have no representation in Parliament. So they see the Stamp Act as a constitutional problem. They see certainly a couple of years later, the Declaratory Act, when Parliament says we have the right to bind you in all cases whatsoever, which actually is a true statement if you're into the British parliamentary sovereign state. But this is where the benign neglect theory comes in. Wait a minute, we've had 100 years of you pretty much leaving us alone, and now you're going to come in with a heavy hand. So colonists see the Declaratory Act as a usurpation, constitutional usurpation of power. And then I mean, Chris can weigh in on the whole writs issue in the 60s. So I'm going to pass it over to Chris at that point, because that's in the 60s as well.
Yeah, I mean, you see these. I mean, you see the writings. The colonists are talking about a constitutional crises, and they're referring to the British Constitution, right? So these acts being unconstitutional, referring to not obviously the U.S. Constitution, but to the British Constitution, and certainly you see that with writs of assistance cases coming out of Boston, and my boy James Otis. And there's that famous line from Adams sitting in the court watching Otis argue these. It said, then and there the child of the rebellion was born. And that was in 1765, 68,
Yep.
somewhere. So, and I'm a firm believer now that, the revolution started 10 years prior to the bullets flying at Lexington and Concord. Because you got to change that thinking in terms of that. I mean, how do you change a group of people's thinking enough that in a few years they're willing to pick up rifles or muskets to fight? So that turn, that revolution, if you will, that change of thinking is a backlash to an overstep of Parliament and all these, and the students know, from the proclamation line of 1763, which Tim spoke of at the conclusion of the French and Indian War, through the series of acts and the colonial responses back and forth. And the writs of assistance cases are a big part of that as well.
And another thing that's all through the 60s, 17, is petitioning in all of these, and that's very British. The right to petition Parliament. So the colonies as individual colonies, as well as eventually a collective in a couple of moments through the 60s, national entities like the Stamp Act Congress. But there's constant petitions going across from the colonies themselves, as well as a national entity. That's very British as well. And they're saying, you are not following your constitution. So the right of petition, and then eventually Jefferson would say, after a long train of abuses, that's kind of code language for, we've been screaming at you for 10 years. We've been petitioning, and it's falling on deaf ears. So that's a very British argument, a very British constitutional argument, I would suggest.
Well, I want you guys to check me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that this is as much an internal debate amongst the colonists, both pre-war and then even over independence, as it is a debate between the colonists and British Parliament there, that this is in no way, shape, or form a popular movement, as I think a lot of our textbooks and our culture likes to present. This is a popular revolution, is that the Americans are very, very divided, over these issues. We were talking about before the program about the Ken Burns documentary on Benjamin Franklin, and
Yep.
there is some very intense debate about the Stamp Act, all right, and about the Declaratory Act, about internal versus external taxation. Is that an accurate view, and something that students need to be aware of? Is this is almost a civil conflict within the colonies as much as it is a conflict with England?
Yeah, it could be perceived as a British Civil War. I think the greatest single piece of pro-British, Tory, loyalist, whatever you want to call it, was an essay by Charles Inglis, The True Interest of America Defined, or something like that. But he makes a religious, he makes a constitutional, he makes an economic. I mean, all the categories are in this piece as to why independence should not be the goal. Now, raising hell, that's very British, by the way. But independence, that's a bridge too far. So I think the Charles Inglis piece is a great example of that internal debate that you talk about, David, within the colonies, within the colonial world itself, about should we stay or should we go? Or, well, there's three options. Should we stay without fighting? Should we stay and fight? Or should we leave and fight? I mean, those three things are in the debate that you've referenced, David.
I heard the Clash in there somewhere.
Professor Williams, I'm going to give you the $60,000 question here. And, you've got a lot of education. I know.
Good night, everybody.
I know it's political science and not necessarily history there, but I know that you're above average in your knowledge of the revolutionary period here. How would you explain this to a high school? It is the American Revolution, and this became a debate, especially around the progressive period in the early 19th century or early 20th century historical debate. Do you see the American Revolution as an economic movement, as a social movement, or as a political movement? And again, I know the easy answer is it's all three, but if you had to weigh them, what would you weigh? Is it economic more so than the other two, social more so, or political more so?
So you're not going to let me say it's all three. So then I'll have to.
We're gonna accept that yes, the answer is it's all three, but I think they have their way. There's a weighted system there, and that's where I think the debate is. And I'm just curious where you are on that.
I guess I was leaning towards sort of the identity cultural, but listening to Tim and Chris just now, I think I've changed my mind. I don't think it was political. Like, I don't think that they went into the revolution having a political system in mind they wanted to replace it with, right? I think that was the last thing on their minds, right? And I kind of was thinking that maybe it was this new identity it formed, but it kind of feels like that even by the 1760s, most folks have their feet in two different camps there. So I guess I'm going to go with my boy Marx and say that
all history.
Oh my God!
Wait, and again, I don't know why this dry.
You can Venmo me the 60,000, by the way. Yeah, no, I think. Look, I think that economic interests are always very, very important in terms of motivations for people to seek out change or to seek the status quo, and I think all of these things that Tim and Chris were just describing, all of these things that are being revoked, they had implications in terms of the kinds of the economy that the colonists were operating in terms of the trade, in terms of the agriculture. And so I think that a lot of them were feeling it there. And if the counterexample happens, if the British decide to not punish them economically, maybe the motivation then isn't as great. So I'm going to go with economic, but I know I stand to be corrected.
Well, no, and I'm with you on that. Is that if it's an interesting revolution if you contrast it with like China and Russia and even the French to a certain degree. This is not a bottom-up revolution. This revolution is led by what we might call the middle class, the merchant class, the property class of the American colonies. All right, they've got to come up with incentive programs to give the poor people to fight on this and give them a wink and a nod at the promise of land afterwards. But whether it's the proclamation of 1763, to me, that's an economic issue because they were looking at the fruits of victory in the 7 Years' War, and that is land, all right, which was being denied to them. We look at the stamp tax, we look at the sugar tax. These are all economic forces that hurt the merchant and upper class landed owners there, and not the impoverished element that Marx talks about or focuses on, the proletariat kind of thing. So I'm with you on that. So I am curious to hear from Professors Moore and Kavanaugh on this issue, where they put the weight, cultural, social, political, or economic.
All right, I'll play the game. I'll make the argument it's social, and it's very simple. In fact, this was a wonderful book written decades ago now, but I still think it holds up to some degree. And the argument is this is the social revolution because Americans are anti-hierarchical. These people resent European social class systems. And because of that idea in their head, that drives all of this. So they're going to have economic resentments. They're going to have religious resentments. They're going to have all kinds of resentments because they're anti-hierarchical people. And maybe that's the impact of benign neglect. They didn't have to live with the heavy hand of parliamentary sovereignty. And so that combined with this much more wide open society, that's a hierarchialism. That's a powerful, powerful social trajectory.
Professor Kavanaugh, you got the last word on this.
Oh, well, I think it's an
Constitution.
I think it is an identity crisis. Was that Mata Hoople? But I think it's identity crisis fueled by economics. I do.
Okay.
Because I agree with what you're saying, Tim, in that idea, because it's, the idea is, so wait a minute, I thought we were British subjects, we're part of the realm, but now you're telling us we're not, and now you're putting this, doing these things to us. It's not cool. But I think, I'm going to channel my inner Charles Beard here, and
so much Marxism here. So much Marxism.
I'm not going with the Constitution. I'm going to go with the Declaration of Independence.
Okay.
I think the Declaration of Independence can be seen as an economic document. Whose name's the biggest? John Hancock. And how does John Hancock make his money? He's making his money by smuggling. He's making his money by controlling the economy, right, of his area. So he's got a big piece of the pie. And now the Brits are coming in and saying, well, we want a piece of that. You're going to surrender some of this through the various acts and provisions that we're now putting on the colonists because, hey, we fought the French, we fought the Native Americans, we helped you here, so now you just got to pay for the war. And that means it's a bigger slice out of his pie. And so, to me, in a way, you have the philosophy within the Declaration of Independence, but it's written by a really large landowner, and you got a guy like George Washington who had already been surveying west of the Proclamation line, looking at some of this property, had an eye on some of that property, and he becomes one of the largest landowners in the early republic. So I think I'm with Mike. I think it's an identity crisis, but it's fueled by economic concerns.
Well, students and teachers, I've hoped that in our 90-minute discussion, and these summer episodes are going to be 90 minutes because we're trying to cover a heck of a lot of material and ideas in a short period of time. We hope that in the last analysis, we are able to give you something to think about, maybe a direction to go in, and also some tangible meat on the bone that you can use yourself as you go through your studies. Next week, we're going to be talking about a very easy topic, and that is the creation of the Constitution, how and why, and the very notion of compromise, and in my own view, selling your soul, for short-term victory and long-term pain there. But it'll be again a very interesting conversation as we look at the articles, the debates of Philadelphia, and the ratification discussion. Until that time, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.